It's always great at events like ATE to actually get overviews, from people who have sort of a very sort of a general view of the whole industry, whether it be accommodation or whether it be aviation or whatever. And I'm here at the moment with Chris Brown, who's the Managing Director of TTF, which is Tourism and Transport Forum. That's right, Chris?
That's the one.
And Chris is a pretty outspoken sort of personality, but he's really organised about what he does and the way he comments about things. Now, Chris, this last week, it's been a very exciting time in tourism over the last couple of weeks with so many things happening. And you made a comment recently about that Sydney wasn't sexy anymore. And I think that's an amazing comment because it impacts on the whole of Australia. Because if Sydney isn't working, then New South Wales isn't working and Australia isn't working. Why did you make that comment and what do you think how do you think it's going to change things?
If your front door's not working, it's hard to get people through the back room. So we need to fix Sydney as a gateway to the nation. It was our Olympic city. It's the city that only 8 years ago welcomed the world on behalf of Australia. And we've had 8 years of inaction by both public and private sector. But I think the comment was made in the context of the New South Wales government starting the rebuilding process last week, putting up the $40 million over 3 years that we've been lobbying for. So to get that announcement on top of another $8 million for Queensland up to their budget because of the Qantas cuts, and the announcement by the federal government that we're going to have a national tourism review, I think we're starting to accept, and I've always said, once you move through denial, the rest is all cure. So we've had to make an industry wake up to itself, both in Sydney and the rest of the country, that unless we focus back on product, on experience, on getting it right, we're going to be in trouble because you can make the argument Australia had lost its mojo and we need to get it back.
But we've just been to the Qantas lunch and Rob Gurney was talking about some of the challenges Qantas is facing. So, not only fuel, but exchange rates and so on. How do you think this industry is going to face things? I mean, we're talking about very challenging times in the next couple of years.
And look, there's no industry on earth, no tourism industry on earth more dependent upon its aviation links than Australia. We're an island continent unto ourselves, a long way from the rest of the world. There is such a dependency between aviation on aviation by tourism that if we see our national carrier having to slice routes, if we've seen problems also for Virgin Blue, the second carrier, it's important we work with them. We've got to keep them viable. We learned from harsh experience when Ansett went under what it does to an industry, and we saw the marvellous creation of Virgin Blue. We've seen lots of airlines pull out of servicing Australia in recent years. So it's vital that we get a balance always between the viability of our domestic carriers and a good balance of liberalising access.
Sure.
Because it's so important to Australian tourism more than any other part of the world. We are so vitally impacted on by our airlines that we've got to get that balance right.
But flights to Europe, for example, at the moment, if you talk to the guys at Emirates and Etihad and so on, even Qantas, they're full. I mean, do we see that continuing into the future, or do you think that the cost of flying is going to impact on those numbers?
Well, let's not forget, they're mostly full with Australians flying overseas for a holiday. Outbound tourism is growing at 30% a year. Inbound tourism is growing, and holidays is basically, for holiday makers rather than total visitors, is in decline, has been for the past 7 years. And domestic is flatline at best or in decline. So the growth sector of Australian tourism is Aussies hopping on a plane and flying overseas. So that's a lot of the reasons why those planes are full.
It's
not full of inbound tourists
coming in.
And you've got airlines that are operating as, for the first time in their 80-year history, operating as commercial beings. They're yield managing. They're not putting more capacity on than they need. Now, we can all whinge about it, and I understand why we would, because we're down the value chain from the airline as a destination. But I don't know what we do otherwise. These guys are running huge businesses that are under huge threat. An extra $2 billion for Qantas this year alone.
It's a lot of money.
Airlines around the world going out of business. The three big challenges that face Australia are faced mostly in tourism. That's how to attract labour skills to drive our industry and workers. 2, the impact of global fuel prices that's heavy from the local petrol station to a Qantas and Virgin Blue. And 3, the downstream impacts of climate change. If they're the 3 big challenges Australia faces to the world, with the world, tourism's almost at the front of the queue at every one of those. That's why we have to get it right. Why we've got to be good at what we do, because there's so many ills arrayed against us.
Now, you spend a lot of time talking to the private and the public sector, but particularly the public sector. The sort of private sector, I think, has woken up to this, because the bottom line is they're going to go out of business or lose money if they don't get this right. But do you think at last we're in an environment where the federal government and the state governments are beginning to talk together and beginning to really understand the value of tourism to the economy of Australia?
Look, there's a new sheriff in town in Canberra. It's a federal government that wants facts, it wants substantive issues. It doesn't just want, here's some more money for an ad, we'll fix it. An industry that sat around for 20 years waiting for the next Hogan to come back to save it, the next killer ad that's going to get us out of trouble, forgetting that we've got to worry about our product, our experience. Now we've got to work out what's on the shelves of the shop, not only what's painted on the shop front window. And that's where the fundamental change needs to come. And I think that's where the federal government's seeing it, and we're seeing the smart state governments cotton onto that as well. The National Tourism Review, announced by Martin Ferguson, will start work on July 3. It kicks off. That will be focusing back on what's wrong with Australian tourism firstly, a study we've just finished, but more importantly, how do we get back out there? How do we make this joint hum again? Get back to where we were, the country that every other country on earth used as its benchmark of success for the past 15 years. That halo slipped well down around our neck at the moment, and we've got to get it back. And I think we've got a federal government working with the states who wants to do that now, and that's good news.
But looking at the jewel in the crown about Sydney and New South Wales, do you think at last we have a New South Wales government that really begins to understand tourism? Yes, in reality, and talking to Matt Brown yesterday, there does seem to be a serious commitment to funding. Is that going to be enough, and is it going to be sufficient to get Sydney onto the top of the agenda and people visiting Sydney, New South Wales and Australia?
I think it is, and I think in celebrating what they're doing now, and full credit to Premier Yemmer and Minister Brown who convinced their cabinet colleagues to listen to what we were saying and to put the money on the table, because they've had literally 7 years of stuffing up the world's great tourism destination. Appalling public policy by Treasury that just kept cutting the budget. But worse than that, it wasn't just about money for ads. They kept telling their agency, we don't think you're very important, we don't rate you very highly, we're not particularly excited by tourism, we put up with the Olympics, let's moved on. I mean, it's an incredible and shameful record, new Olympic record, how to turn Olympic Games into a negative for tourism that we managed with Sydney. The good news is they've crossed the Rubicon, they've turned the corner, they're going to get it right, I hope. They realised and admitted they'd stuffed it up, and they're going to fix it. And they're going to fix it most importantly in partnership with industry. So consult with industry on how to spend the money, and to recognise it's about product, it's about fixing up the experience, and then going to market with a great ad.
Fantastic.
Once you've got the shop working.
Yeah, well, Chris, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, John.
It's John Alwyn-Jones reporting for Travel Mail TV from AT 2008, and from what Chris is saying, it looks like we're in a new dawn of tourism and the public and private sector working together, and also more importantly, I suppose, in a sense, the federal and state governments working together.